This video is sponsored by the military online game War Thunder. Welcome to part 2 of our examination of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where we continue his story as the world entered World War II and how FDR violated several laws to ensure that the United States became involved. Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. War Thunder is the most comprehensive military combat game ever made, with over 2,000 playable tanks, planes, ships, and combined arms tactics for player versus player battles. Every vehicle is incredibly detailed, offering a highly immersive combat experience. Play now, free, on PC, Xbox Series, XNS, PlayStation 5, or the previous console generation. War Thunder offers the most intense player versus player battles at various immersion levels for all playing styles. Sit back and smoke your enemies from afar, or go in guns blazing. You can customize your vehicles with hundreds of camouflage, historical markings, as well as 3D decorators, such as bushes and equipment readily available at your fingertips. The realistic vehicle graphics, vehicle destruction, and sound effects as you smite your enemies got me hooked on War Thunder. Play War Thunder now for free across all platforms on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using this link that will also be in the video description below. New War Thunder players, as well as those that haven't played for the last 6 months, can claim a large bonus pack by using the link. The pack includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, and exclusive 3D decorator for vehicles, and much more. But act now because the offer is only available for a limited time. Franklin Roosevelt knew that the United States needed to get into the Second World War in order to get the country completely out of the Great Depression. In April of 1933, he signed Executive Order 6102, confiscating all gold coins, bullion, and gold certificates from privately held concentrations in American hands. He basically stole gold and gave bottom-line dollar values on that money. None of his great schemes, as previously mentioned, had really improved the quality of life of American citizens. Unemployment was still high, and the economy was on life support. Another great stain on his presidency was the fact that he was a staunch advocate of racial segregation in the military. He did nothing to alter the Jim Crow laws employed by various states, often in direct violation of federal law, especially on voting rights. It was only at the insistence of the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, an apparently far more enlightened person than the Department of the Army, who allowed the training of black pilots at Tuskegee, Alabama. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and following this, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. Roosevelt and Churchill planned on getting the U.S. into the war as soon as possible, as clearly stated in the telegram Churchill sent to FDR on October 5, 1939, regarding the American Navy extending their patrol zones 300 miles into the Atlantic, violating maritime and international law. Churchill hoped that American naval ships would patrol the entire western Atlantic as both escorts for fuel and munitions transports headed to Britain and report back on any German surface ship or U-boat activity, which was what FDR planned on doing. Churchill's correspondences went through U.S. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy Sr. through the U.S. Embassy, as opposed to first going through the British Foreign Office, which was a violation of protocol. Additionally, FDR agreed to loan the British 50 World War I era destroyers to assist with their anti-submarine efforts, with a deal to have U.S. naval assets placed in British possessions in the Caribbean and West Africa. Also, the U.S. was producing a moderate amount of war materiel, such as tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition, which were being sent to the United Kingdom in violation of neutrality laws, and the Germans knew it. The Lend-Lease proposal passed in Congress, but with the caveat that the U.S. could not display any overt support of the British should Japan attack their interests in Asia. On March 8, 1940, the Senate approved it. The act permitted Franklin Roosevelt to sell, lend, or lease munitions, aircraft, weapons, and military supplies to, quote, the government of any country whose defense the President deems vital to the defense of the United States. Great Britain was one of those countries. He also allowed the creation of the Eagle Squadrons, where American pilots would enlist in the Royal Air Force after being trained in Canada, unless they were already U.S. trained to help Britain, and many flew during the Battle of Britain. On March 19th, FDR received a request from Churchill for U.S. ships and aircraft to help locate the German cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The April 2nd FDR announcement was the increase in the American shipbuilding program and the placing of Americans in Iceland and Senegal, West Africa. At this time, he accelerated the building of oil tankers and merchantmen in aiding Britain, which would later support Stalin by running ships in convoys to Archangel and Murmansk, as well as supplies such as oil and gasoline, arms and materiel through Persia for the Middle East campaign. In order to do this, FDR approved American destroyer escorts to provide security to the convoys headed to Europe. This was in fact beyond the scope of his legal authority without notifying Congress, not just in the fact that he was violating neutrality laws, but he was actively engaging American forces in direct combat. In April, FDR had dispatched American troops to Greenland with the permission of the Danish government, which controlled the island to keep it out of German hands and to provide protection for convoys ferrying material to Great Britain. FDR also illegally extended U.S. territorial waters all the way to Iceland to assist the British, in total violation of international laws. He wanted to get into the war against Germany at all costs, but due to the strong isolationist movement led by transatlantic air hero Charles Lindbergh, he needed a legitimate reason to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Therefore, he knowingly placed Americans in harm's way. And as a result, on September 4, 1941, U-652, commanded by Georg Werner Fratz, reportedly attacked the destroyer USS Greer, quote, without provocation, as she steamed alone toward Iceland. The official story was that Greer dodged 2 torpedoes and counterattacked with depth charges. As Roosevelt told the country, quote, the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer without warning, and with deliberate design to sink her. What FDR lied to the public about was the fact that Greer was directed to the U-boat by British patrol aircraft, and the Greer attacked the U-boat first when it dropped depth charges in conjunction with the aircraft bombing, and both were equally ineffective, but the attack made it the first American ship to fire on a German vessel. In response, Roosevelt ordered the Navy to shoot on sight any Axis warship found in waters, quote, the protection of which is necessary for American defense. FDR wanted war, and he wanted it badly. A comparative analysis covers another naval clash a quarter of a century later, which would similarly help move the United States into a new war. As the facts of the Gulf of Tonkin incident also turned out to be different than what the President, Lyndon B. Johnson, said at the time, Senator J. William Fulbright would remark, quote, Roosevelt's deviousness in a good cause made it easier for Lyndon Johnson to practice the same kind of deviousness in a bad cause. The North Atlantic came within the scope of this order. Roosevelt's logic was simple. If you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him. Again, on October 17, 1941, the USS Kearney was torpedoed by U-568, commanded by Joachim Preuss, off the coast of Iceland as she went to the rescue of a 50-ship convoy in international waters. The U-boats had already torpedoed several merchant ships. The Carney began dropping depth charges, a clear violation of neutrality, but survived the attack and reached port. It was later repaired and returned to duty, but 11 sailors were killed and 22 more injured. Hitler's torpedo, Roosevelt said, was directed at every American. But America did not go to war over this act of war. Even Roosevelt knew that the Carney's attack on German submarines was a first strike that could have doomed his presidency. However, FDR was hoping that Germany would declare war as a result. In their correspondence from November 10th to 16th, Winston Churchill also wanted FDR to use his influence in convincing the Vichy French government to not hand over their ships to the Germans, and FDR offered to buy 2 new French battleships under construction as to not fall into German hands. That eventuality resulted in the sinking of the destroyer USS Reuben James as she escorted British convoy HX-156, with all ships flying the Union Jack, and were in effect legitimate targets. U-552, commanded by Erich Topp, was part of the wolf pack shadowing the convoy. His orders were clear: sink all British shipping wherever it may be. Topp stated this in his own words during my personal interview with him. Topp said, quote, "We had orders to prevent the American supplies from reaching England. We were sinking a lot of ships. We called this the happy time. We also knew that the Americans had given the British 50 old destroyers. It was common sense that if destroyers were escorting a British convoy, then they were also legitimate targets." On October 31, 1941, at daybreak, Reuben James was about 600 miles west of Ireland and blacked out to avoid reflection in the inquisitive monocles of a U-boat periscopes, as Newsweek put it. A torpedo fired by U-552 hit her on the port side, igniting her forward magazine, and blew her in half. Of the ship's crew, only 45 were saved. 99 sailors died, including all 7 of the ship's officers. The international fallout was almost immediate. A New York Times editorial said that the sinking brushes away the last possible doubt that the United States and Germany are now at open war in the Atlantic. The New York Times also printed, "The people, their representatives in Congress, and even high officials of the government are deeply divided on the subject." FDR knew that he was walking a fine line, and in fact he may have been concerned about impeachment proceedings being started as a result from the Republicans in Congress. But FDR had his supporters, such as Navy Secretary Frank Knox, stating the attack was worse than piracy, and Senator Alben Barkley of Kentucky, who accused the Germans of trying to drive us off the seas, and I don't believe the American people are ready to be driven off. Senator George Aiken of Vermont, however, said that Roosevelt was personally responsible for whatever lives may have been lost because he had ordered convoy duty. The Russian newspaper Pravda praised the United States for having taken its fighting post, and the London Daily Mail predicted that the United States was marching down the last mile to a declaration of war. The public German response was also immediate. Quote, "Anybody walking along the railroad tracks at night should not be surprised if they get run over by an express train." U.S. Senator Gerald P. Nye of North Dakota seemed to agree. He said, "You can't expect to walk into a barroom brawl and hope to stay out of the fight." Japanese officials were strangely silent. However, privately, Adolf Hitler was less than pleased at the incident, which was the 3rd American ship attacked by his U-boats. Although none of these attacks were illegal under maritime law or the Geneva Convention of 1929, Hitler did not want the United States drawn into the war in Europe. According to SS Lieutenant General Karl Wolff, quote, "Hitler was quite upset at the sinking of the Reuben James. The other attacks had also disturbed him, but he understood what his U-boat commanders were up against, such as surviving attacks and proper warship identification. He did issue the order through Dönitz that all the commanders must make certain of their identification so as to not bring America into the war. On that, he was most sincere and determined." What is of great interest is the fact that Reuben James was not flying the American ensign, according to Erich Topp, who said, "Whenever I saw a ship, we compared that to the international registry. a book of silhouettes and details of every ship known to be afloat. The Americans giving the British destroyers only increased the attention to detail, and when I saw the Reuben James, it was a Clemson-class destroyer, older, and it was not flying the American flag. Also, it was protecting the British convoy, and it took aggressive action against us. I fired my torpedoes to protect my boat and to allow us to continue on our patrol. FDR would have to wait for a more tangible event to get the war he wanted. However, Roosevelt's interests were not just limited to Germany and the European War. Churchill had great concerns about Japan, which had invaded China years earlier and was in French Indochina and threatening British and Dutch colonies in Asia. Churchill wanted the same American support in the Indian Ocean as he did in the Atlantic, where the Japanese threat was growing. FDR had already been supplying Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces in China as he fought the Japanese in that country, often alongside Mao Zedong, who led the communist forces when they were not fighting each other. The American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, were flying mercenaries who had been supporting Chiang flying out of Rangoon, Burma, and China, and were heavily involved in fighting the Japanese in the air and on the ground. But they were on the Kuomintang payroll, not the United States, as each pilot resigned his commission to fly for a foreign nation. But the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 changed everything into FDR's favor. The declaration of war against Japan was ratified by both houses of Congress, and Hitler stupidly declared war on the United States on December 11th. One of the major problems historians had with FDR was his ordering General MacArthur to abandon the Philippine Islands, while leaving General Jonathan M. Wainwright and his staff, along with 19 other American and 4 Filipino generals, with about 23,000 American military personnel and 100,000 Filipino soldiers who would be killed or captured. FDR also allowed the U.S. Navy assets, in particular 27 submarines, to withdraw to Australia without even trying to intervene. As America entered the war, unemployment was almost non-existent as the war industry exploded and military conscription, as well as the millions of volunteers, swelled the ranks of the military. Now fighting in the Pacific as well as the North Atlantic, to his credit, FDR did the smartest thing any national leader could do. He allowed the military leadership to conduct the war while he handled foreign policy and the new alliance. Unlike Churchill, Hitler, Tojo, Mussolini, and Stalin, Roosevelt had faith in his military leadership. He at least knew his own limitations in that regard and relied upon his senior generals and admirals to conduct the war without his hands-on interference. His reliance upon George C. Marshall as Army Chief of Staff proved very sound. One of the least discussed issues was FDR authorizing the recruitment of the Italian Mafia in the war effort. From his new prison, mob boss Salvatore Luciana, better known as Lucky Luciano, still ran the longshoremen. His efforts prevented sabotage by Axis agents, and his men tracked down and reported on German and Italian spies in all the major port cities around the Northeast United States. In April 1942, John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers, told President Roosevelt that due to unsafe working conditions, low pay, and lousy benefits, the coal miners would go on strike. The union demands included a basic wage increase, a guaranteed work week, pay for underground travel time, and double pay for Sunday work. An impasse was reached in the bargaining process, and after the operators had rejected a compromise proposal, the dispute was referred to the National War Labor Board. Roosevelt ordered Secretary of the Interior Harold L. Ickes to take over and operate all mines under federal authority, threatening the miners with prison and fines. The miners were less than impressed. In response, on May 1, 1943, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9340, which placed coal mines under the control of the federal government. But even with the mines now under government operation, the miners continued to fight. At Roosevelt's urging, Congress passed legislation on May 6, 1943, making it a crime to instigate a strike in war plants or mines that had been taken over by the government. Those who challenged it were prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Roosevelt threatened to call out the troops unless miners returned to work, but miners merely shrugged it off and proclaimed what would become their classic phrase, "You can't dig coal with bayonets." Negotiations continued, and the miners returned to work under the new terms, and in November 1943, they eventually won wage increases and pay for travel from the shaft head to the coalface. However, despite the fact that he did make some very bad decisions as the war went on, one of his better decisions was working with Churchill on the Casablanca Directive, named for the Casablanca Conference held in Morocco in January 1943. This was revised as the Point Blank Directive on June 14, 1943, which prioritized the targets to be bombed in Europe to impede Axis war-making potential. Focusing upon critical factors such as petroleum facilities, U-boat and shipbuilding facilities, aircraft manufacturing, ball bearings, etc., the strategic bombing plan was set up in conjunction with Royal Air Force Bomber Command. He also gave U.S. Army Air Force commanders latitude to select their targets based upon mission viability, weather, and the availability of fighter escort aircraft, which at that time was minimal. The war at sea fell to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, who had good leaders under him in the Pacific with Admirals Chester Nimitz, William Halsey, and others, working with the contentious and often imperious Army General Douglas MacArthur. Roosevelt and Churchill decided that Europe was the primary focus, so the bulk of the resources would be deployed to fight Hitler and Mussolini. The Pacific and Asian theaters would be dealt with in due time and with a slower forward momentum, being, as it was an island-hopping campaign, getting U.S. forces closer to being able to bomb Japan directly. Some of the controversial decisions FDR approved of have come to light. For example, Army Lieutenant General Mark Clark's decision to take Rome by bypassing German troops was actually a plan submitted by South African Field Marshal Jan Christian Smuts. Churchill and FDR agreed that Italian morale, while very low, was not sufficient to expect a mass surrender of their forces, unless they lost their capital. In this vein, Clark's decision was considered sound, as the Italian government did in fact surrender on September 8, 1943. One of the best decisions in history was FDR facilitating the Manhattan Project, the secret development of the atomic bombs under Major General Leslie Groves, and the recruitment of the best and brightest nuclear physicists and engineers in the world. In another display of proper decision-making by FDR, he kept his hands out of the planning for the invasion of France, allowing the Allied Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, to plan the D-Day invasion with his general staff, which hastened the end of the war. It was well known in many circles that FDR had a soft spot for Stalin and the Communists. Even his Vice President Harry S. Truman could not understand this affectation. The same could be said of all of the senior military commanders. As stated by Army General Matthew Ridgway, quote, "The special feelings Roosevelt had for Stalin were beyond my comprehension, as well as that of many others. He totally disbelieved the evidence that the Russians had been behind the Katyn massacre, and he still blamed the Germans for it. This despite the evidence and the testimonies of Poles who escaped and managed to make it to England." FDR also capitulated to Stalin at the Yalta Conference in 1945, where he and Churchill joined the dictator to discuss the post-war condition of Europe. Stalin agreed to hold free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. Of course, Roosevelt believed Stalin and took him at his word, whereas Churchill never believed him for a minute. Pamela Churchill Harriman also had her own perspective. Being married to the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, she stated, quote, "Avril was quite gobsmacked that Roosevelt did not insist in writing that Stalin guaranteed the free elections after the war. But then again, he said, Stalin would not have kept his word anyway, and Winston knew it, as did I." In essence, FDR caved into almost every demand Stalin made, to include the demand that all Soviet citizens, civilians, or prisoners of war in German hands be handed over to him. Churchill knew what that would mean, and he resisted. But FDR held all the cards and the purse strings. There was still a war in Asia to be won. FDR's failure to stand up to Stalin may have had less to do with his acceptance of the communist and more to do with his failing health and declining mental sharpness. Regardless of the reason, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was single-handedly the one man above all others who helped establish the Cold War, depending upon which hypotheticals you believe. The switching of Eastern Europe from one dictator to another that Churchill feared was set in motion. Roosevelt had been in obviously declining health for a number of years. A March 1944 examination by his doctors revealed a variety of heart ailments, high blood pressure, and bronchitis. Those close to the president, even those who saw him speak in public, noted his haggard and weak appearance, his flagging energy, and his increasing lapses of concentration and memory. Most of the American public was unaware of these ailments, although rumors about his health were rampant. FDR delivered a few important speeches in 1944 that quieted many of these concerns. Nonetheless, Roosevelt's election victory over Thomas E. Dewey in 1944, in addition to the war and the Yalta Conference the following February, put him under immense strain. In April 1945, FDR returned to Warm Springs, Georgia, a destination that had served since the 1920s as his favorite retreat. There, on April 12th, while sitting for a portrait, he collapsed and died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Vice President Harry Truman took the oath of office the same day. Perhaps Roosevelt's most lasting international legacy, along with First Lady Eleanor and Winston Churchill, was the establishment of the United Nations, which had ambitious and honorable ambitions, if not a tainted history of failure thereafter. Remember to check out War Thunder now, for free on the PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using this link, and get your free bonus pack. No ifs, no maybes. I'll see you on the battlefield. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.